The dawn over the Iberian plains broke with a quiet that belied centuries of conflict. Mists rolled over the hills of Beira and the valleys of the Tagus, softening the scars left by war and time. In the faint light, the land seemed to breathe, a fragile kingdom still being shaped by sword and prayer. It was the 12th century, and Portugal was a dream not yet solidified, a frontier realm carved from struggle and devotion. In that early age, the world of Christendom was defined by boundaries both physical and divine. To the south lay Al-Andalus, a landscape of minarets and marble, ruled by the Moors, where the call to prayer echoed through the deserts and orchards. To the north and west, new Christian kingdoms were rising, their monarchs driven by faith and necessity to reclaim lands once lost. Among them stood a determined young ruler, Afonso Henriques, a prince who would become Portugal's first king. His vision was simple in word, but vast in ambition: to forge a realm independent from both Muslim emirs and the shadow of Leon and Castile. Yet such dreams demanded more than courage. They required men who could bind faith to arms, who could turn prayer into fortress walls. And so, across the hills and valleys of Portugal, the red cross of the Knights Templar appeared. They came as a disciplined brotherhood, warrior monks sworn to poverty, chastity, and obedience. Their arrival was both a spiritual and political act, sanctioned by Rome and welcomed by kings. Cloaked in white, bearing the crimson cross upon their mantles, they built their commanderies where the frontiers burned brightest: Tomar, Sore, and Pombal. From these strongholds, they watched the horizon for signs of the enemy and guarded the fragile peace that allowed villages to grow in the shadow of war. In the stillness of their monasteries, the Templars prayed. In the roar of battle, they fought. Their dual nature mirrored the contradictions of the age, a world both contemplative and cruel, where salvation was often measured by conquest. To Afonso Henriques, the Templars were more than holy warriors. They were architects of sovereignty. With their aid, he pushed the borders southward, wresting Santarém and Lisbon from Moorish control. In these victories, the foundations of Portugal were laid, stone by stone, oath by oath. Yet beneath the triumphs lingered an unease. The Templars answered not to the king, but to the Pope. Their loyalty, though fierce, belonged to a power beyond the realm. In the quiet hours after battle, as the fires dimmed and the wounded murmured their prayers, the question of allegiance hovered in the air. Portugal was free, but could it remain so if its guardians looked elsewhere for command? In the decades that followed, the Templar houses became more than military garrisons. They were centers of order and administration, repositories of wealth and knowledge. Their knights managed lands, collected tithes, and offered refuge to pilgrims crossing the Iberian heartland. The fortress at Tomar, built upon sacred rock, rose like a crown above the Ribatejo plains, a silent testament to endurance. From its towers, the Templars could see far into the south, into lands still held by the Moors, and farther still into the unknown horizon that one day would call Portuguese sailors to sea. But the winds of Christendom were fickle. In distant France, whispers began to darken the Templars' name. Accusations of heresy, greed, and secret rites spread through courts and cloisters alike. What began as rumor became inquisition. What began as suspicion became decree. When the dawn of the 14th century arrived, the world that had raised the Templars turned against them. Pope Clement V,
under the pressure of King Philip IV of France, issued the bull that would dissolve the order. Across Europe, their lands were seized, their leaders imprisoned, and their banners torn down. Fire consumed the faithful. Silence followed. Yet Portugal was different. The kingdom that had been born under the Templars' protection could not so easily condemn them. King Dingus, the wise and measured ruler of the time, found himself at a crossroads between obedience to Rome and loyalty to the men who had built his fortresses, defended his people, and shaped his crown. Rather than surrender their legacy to oblivion, he sought transformation. The king opened quiet negotiations with the Holy See, appealing for clemency, for the chance to preserve what was good, while setting aside what was condemned. And so, in the years that followed, the ashes of the Templar order began to smolder once more in the Portuguese heartland. The name would change, the symbols would shift, but the spirit, disciplined, devout, and steadfast, would endure. Beyond the murmuring olive groves and sun-drenched plains of Alentejo, a new brotherhood began to take form. In the modest town of Aviz, among the stones of an ancient monastery, the seeds of renewal were sown. The men who would one day wear the green cross of Aviz did not yet know their destiny. They trained in silence, kept their vows, and waited for the word that would define their lives. The land was changing. The world beyond was restless, and from the ruins of one order, another would rise, forged in secrecy, bound by faith, and destined to shape the course of a kingdom that would soon look not to its borders, but to the sea.
The monastery of Aviz stood like a prayer turned to stone. Nestled among the gentle hills of the Alentejo plains, it was neither grand nor opulent, yet its silence held an air of purpose. Olive trees framed its walls, their leaves shimmering under the southern sun, whispering secrets to the wind. In the cloisters, monks moved with measured calm, their robes brushing against ancient stone, their lips murmuring psalms that rose like incense into the vaulted air. It was here, in this quiet corner of Portugal, that the remnants of a fallen order were reborn. The year was 1320, and the echoes of the Templars' destruction still haunted Christendom. Across Europe, their fortresses lay abandoned or occupied by new masters. Their name, once uttered with reverence, had become a warning. Yet in Portugal, where gratitude outweighed suspicion, King Dinis sought not to erase their legacy, but to preserve it beneath a new light. With the blessing of Pope John XXII, a new order of knighthood was established, the Order of Aviz. It was a rebirth not of defiance, but of quiet resilience. The Pope's bull, issued from the heart of Avignon, declared that this brotherhood would serve both God and the crown of Portugal. Their purpose was simple and sacred: to defend the faith, guard the frontiers, and nurture the peace that allowed a kingdom to thrive. The knights who gathered beneath the green cross of Aviz were a different breed from their predecessors. Where the Templars had looked to Jerusalem, these men looked to Lisbon, Évora, and the rugged lands that marked Portugal's southern edge. Their allegiance was dual, to heaven and to the king who ruled in its shadow. In this delicate balance of devotion and duty lay the strength that would define them for centuries. Their symbol, the green cross fleury, soon adorned their robes, banners, and shields. It was a sign of renewal, green for life and hope, its flaring ends representing faith's eternal unfolding. To those who sought fluttering above the battlements, it was both a promise and a warning that the guardians of Portugal still kept vigil, even as the world beyond shifted in turmoil. The Order's early years were years of rebuilding. The lands once held by the Templars were transferred, field by field, to their care. Fortresses such as Aviz, Palmela, and Alcácer do Sal
became centers of their new dominion, strongholds of both stone and spirit. The knights repaired walls, cultivated fields, and trained squires who would carry the order's legacy forward. Within the monastery's walls, their days followed the rhythm of the monastic hours: prayer before dawn, training in the morning light, silence through the heat of noon. In the refectory, they dined simply: bread, olives, and water drawn from cool cisterns. The vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience remained unbroken, though their purpose had subtly changed. These were no longer crusaders bound for distant wars. They were custodians of a kingdom still learning to stand on its own. Portugal itself was changing. The Reconquista, though not yet complete, had given the realm a fragile peace. Towns flourished under royal charters, markets thrived along riverbanks, and the first stirrings of culture began to bloom in the courts and monasteries. The Knights of Aviz became more than defenders of faith. They became stewards of this new prosperity. In the quiet fields surrounding their commanderies, they taught farmers to till the soil more wisely, to build irrigation channels, and to store grain against famine. Their houses became centers of administration and justice, places where disputes were settled not by sword, but by law. Through their example, Portugal's frontier transformed from wasteland to homeland, from contested ground to sacred soil. Yet beyond the serenity of these plains, Europe trembled. In France, where the Templars had been burned, kings and popes still wrestled for power. To the east, the Ottoman tide pressed closer to the remnants of Byzantium. The Holy Land was lost, and with it, the dream that had once bound Christian knighthood together. In this shifting world, the Order of Aviz found its own identity. It was not born to reclaim Jerusalem, but to guard the threshold between old and new, between faith's medieval zeal and a dawning age of reason and exploration. The Order's leaders, the Masters of Aviz, served as both abbots and captains. Their authority extended from the cloistered to the field, uniting spiritual guidance with temporal command. Under their watch, the Order's network expanded across the land, its influence growing quietly but steadily. Villages sprang up around their holdings, bound by the protection of the Green Cross. From their chapter meetings came plans not only for defense, but for governance. The knights advised kings, mediated disputes among nobles, and lent their disciplined minds to the shaping of Portugal's early institutions. In this way, the order became both sword and spine, the hidden framework upon which a stable kingdom could rise. By the middle of the 14th century, Portugal's borders had solidified, and its ambitions began to look beyond them. The Atlantic, vast and uncharted, stretched westward like a blue mystery calling from the edge of the known world. For now, the Knights of Aviz still guarded the land. But the restless horizon, the eternal frontier, waited. In the dim candlelight of Aviz Monastery, scribes recorded the names of those who took the vow. Some would die defending the frontier. Others would live to see the order transformed into something greater than any could imagine. Each night, as the bells tolled and silence fell across the plains, the brothers knelt in prayer. Their chant rose into the starlit air, mingling with the wind that drifted over fields and fortresses alike, a reminder that even in peace, vigilance endures. The green cross gleamed faintly in the moonlight, painted on the shield stacked beside the chapel door. It was a quiet symbol now, almost forgotten beyond these walls. But in time, it would rise again, not on battlements, but on sails that would cross oceans. The world was waiting for the next dawn, and with it, a destiny that even the Knights of Aviz could scarcely dream of.
The century turned, and with it came a new breath in the life of Portugal. By the mid-1300s, the kingdom stood balanced between memory and possibility, a realm no longer born of conquest alone, but shaped by the steady hands of those who tended it. From the vineyards of the Douro to the windswept plains of Alentejo, Peace had settled like a thin veil over a land once scorched by war. Yet within that peace stirred a quiet vigilance, a knowing that fortune could turn as swiftly as the tide. The Order of Aviz had grown in strength and esteem. Its monasteries were now centers of discipline and governance. Its members trusted not merely as soldiers of God, but as instruments of the crown. The green cross, once a modest emblem, had become a familiar sight, carved into chapel doors, embroidered on cloaks, etched above city gates. It was both a mark of piety and an assurance of protection. Within the walls of their fortresses, the rhythm of life was precise, almost monastic in its order. At dawn, bells summoned the brothers to prayer. By mid-morning, the clang of steel echoed across the courtyards as squires trained with wooden swords beneath the watchful eyes of their masters. In the refectories, silence was broken only by the soft murmur of scripture. Yet beyond the quiet discipline lay an undercurrent of purpose, the knowledge that Portugal's destiny was still being written, and that the order would help shape its script. King Dynasty had passed, leaving behind a legacy of peace and progress. His successors maintained the alliance between crown and cross, ensuring that the Order of Aviz remained deeply entwined with the nation's identity. Where once the Templars had been seen as a power apart, the Aviz Knights were woven into the very fabric of Portuguese life. Their role, however, began to evolve. The battles against the Moors were fewer now, replaced by skirmishes of diplomacy and trade. The order's revenues came not from war spoils, but from fertile estates and merchant tolls. Knights once sworn to ride at dawn now managed vineyards, supervised mills, and dispensed justice in the king's name. The sword and the plow had become partners, and in that union, Portugal prospered. Still, the order never forgot its martial roots. In the barracks of Aviz and the towers of Palmela, young men trained in the ancient ways of chivalry. They studied the tactics of siege and defense, the care of horses, the discipline of formation. But they also studied philosophy, languages, and law. A knight of Aviz was expected to be both warrior and scholar, a servant of the mind as well as of the cross. Among the brothers, stories of the past lingered like incense. The tales of the old Templars were whispered in the candlelight, of their fall, their trials, and the hidden relics said to have vanished when their order was destroyed. These were not told as legends of rebellion, but as parables of humility and endurance. To the men of Aviz, the lesson was clear. Strength must serve faith, not pride. Yet the 14th century would soon test both faith and strength. Across Europe, the winds of plague began to blow. The Black Death, unseen and unstoppable, crept through cities and fields alike. It came not with armies, but with silence. The silence of empty streets, of bells tolling for the dead, of prayers unanswered. In Portugal, as in many lands, despair took root. Fields lay fallow, monasteries emptied, and towns shuttered their gates. Yet within the cloisters of Aviz, the brothers endured. They cared for the sick, buried the fallen, and held vigil when others fled. Their discipline, that careful harmony of body and soul, became a shield against chaos. When the pestilence finally receded, the order found itself transformed once again. Many of its knights had perished, but those who survived bore the mark of endurance. They had seen the fragility of human life and the strength of divine purpose. From that understanding grew a deeper sense of mission, not merely to defend, but to guide. In the decades that followed, the order's influence deepened across the kingdom. New estates were granted in recognition of service. Young nobles sought admission, drawn not by promises of glory, but by the order's quiet prestige. To be a knight of Aviz was to belong to a lineage of guardians,
men who carried the memory of Portugal's struggles and the hope of its future. Then, in the late 1300s, the peace that had settled so carefully over the land began to tremble. The old king, Ferdinand I, died without a legitimate heir, leaving the throne uncertain. Whispers spread through the court like wind through dry grass, whispers of Castilian ambition, of treaties and betrayals. The question that now faced Portugal was not of faith or plague, but of survival itself. Amid the growing unrest, the eyes of the people turned toward a figure who embodied both devotion and courage. John, master of the Order of Aviz. He was the illegitimate son of King Peter I, and though born outside the line of succession, he had inherited the blood of kings and the discipline of the monastic knight. To some, he was a man of the church. To others, a potential savior of the realm. As Castile pressed its claim and noble factions divided, the Green Cross once again became a banner of resistance. In the halls of Aviz Monastery, the brothers gathered in solemn council. Their vows of obedience to Rome and to the crown had guided them for generations. But now the very definition of crown and kingdom stood in peril. The wind swept across the plains, rustling the olive trees that had watched over them for centuries. In that wind was the whisper of fate, a call to arms not for conquest, but for preservation. In the years to come, the name of Aviz would no longer belong only to a brotherhood. It would become the name of a dynasty, the symbol of a nation reborn through loyalty, courage, and the quiet strength of those who had waited so long in the shadows. The Green Cross, once the mark of hidden knights, was about to shine upon the heart of Portugal itself.
The year was 1383, and the air over Portugal carried the tension of an uncertain dawn. The bells of Lisbon tolled in uneasy rhythm, their echoes mingling with the murmur of crowds that filled the narrow streets. King Ferdinand I was dead, and the realm he left behind teetered on the edge of oblivion. The winds of history gathered over the Tagus, and the fate of Portugal, its crown, its freedom, its very soul, hung in fragile balance. The throne, by law, should have passed to Beatrice, Ferdinand's only daughter. Yet Beatrice had been wed to King Juan I of Castile, a union meant to bring peace, but instead sowing fear. To many in Portugal, the marriage signaled not alliance, but absorption. Castilian banners already loomed along the frontier. Their knights spoke not of partnership, but of dominion. The people whispered that Portugal would soon become a province, its independence a memory buried under the weight of foreign rule. Amid this unease, the monasteries and fortresses of the Order of Aviz stood as islands of calm. The brothers, disciplined and patient, had seen turmoil before. But this was no distant crusade or passing quarrel. It was the heart of their homeland at stake. For generations they had sworn to protect Portugal's faith and crown. Now the two seemed at odds, and the brothers of Aviz faced a choice that would redefine their destiny. Their leader, João, the master of Aviz, had long been known for his quiet strength. The illegitimate son of King Peter I and Inés Pires, he had no claim to nobility by birthright, yet commanded the respect of nobles and knights alike. Trained in the ways of faith and war, he embodied the balance his order cherished: humility without weakness, piety without passivity. As chaos spread through the kingdom, João became a symbol of resistance. He refused to bow to Castile's claim, declaring that Portugal must remain free, its king chosen by its people, not imposed by a foreign crown. His words were measured, but his conviction was iron. And when Lisbon erupted in rebellion, it was under his banner that the city's defenders rallied. In the spring of 1384, the struggle for Portugal's soul began in earnest.
the master of Aviz, now proclaimed defender of the realm, gathered knights and commoners alike beneath the green cross. Farmers left their fields, merchants their stalls, and monks their cloisters. They came not for conquest, but for preservation, to keep alive the fragile light of independence kindled a century before. The battles that followed were fierce and uncertain. Castilian forces, vast and disciplined, swept across the border with the confidence of empire. Portuguese towns fell and rose again in quick succession. Yet amid the chaos, the Knights of Aviz fought with a calm born of purpose. They were few in number, but their resolve burned bright. In the fortresses of Alentejo and along the walls of Lisbon, the green cross flew beside the banner of the city, symbols of defiance against overwhelming odds. The brothers prayed before battle, their chants echoing through the stone halls. They fought not only with swords, but with faith, believing that their cause was sanctified by the same divine will that had once guided the founders of Portugal. As months turned to years, the conflict hardened into a test of endurance. Villages were burned, fields trampled, and families scattered. Yet in the midst of hardship, something remarkable took root, a unity unseen before among the Portuguese people. Nobles and peasants stood side by side. Clerics blessed the same blades they once condemned. The Order of Aviz, born from the ashes of the Templars, had once been a guardian of faith. Now it became the beating heart of a nation's hope. Then, in the summer of 1385, the struggle reached its crescendo. On the fields near the small village of Aljubarrota, the armies of Castile and Portugal met in decisive battle. The Castilian host, led by King Juan himself, numbered in the tens of thousands, armored knights, mounted lancers, archers from distant provinces. Facing them was a smaller force commanded by João, a master of Aviz, and his trusted ally, Nuno Alvarez Pereira, a man whose brilliance in war would earn him sainthood in the centuries to come. The morning of battle was shrouded in mist. From the ridges above the valley, the green crosses of Aviz gleamed faintly in the dawn. João rode among his men, his voice calm, his eyes steady. There was no grandeur in his speech, no promise of glory, only the solemn assurance that they fought for their home. The clash when it came was thunderous. For hours the valley rang with the roar of steel and the cries of men. Castile's cavalry charged, only to find the Portuguese earth itself turned against them, ditches dug by night, traps set by cunning hands. The Knights of Aviz held their ground like stone, unyielding in formation, their faith as firm as their shields. When the sun finally broke through the clouds, the banners of Castile lay trampled in the mud. The invaders were in retreat. Their king fled the field. Portugal, against all odds, had prevailed. In the aftermath, silence fell over Aljubarrota. The fields were strewn with armor and broken lances, but also with the strange peace that follows great struggle. Among the fallen, the brothers of Aviz knelt in prayer, giving thanks not only for victory, but for the preservation of their people. Days later, João entered Lisbon not as master of an order, but as king of a nation. He was crowned João I of Portugal, the first monarch of the Aviz dynasty. In that moment, the monastery-born brotherhood had ascended beyond its walls. The cross of Aviz had become the cross of the kingdom. Under his rule, Portugal would flourish. His court would be filled with visionaries and explorers, poets and princes. The children of the Aviz line would carry their father's spirit to the edges of the known world, guiding ships into seas yet uncharted. But on that first quiet night after Aljubarrota, as the king looked upon the candles burning in the monastery of Aviz. He knew that the true victory was not in crowns or banners, but in endurance, the unbroken chain of faith that had carried Portugal through darkness into light. And so, from the silence of a monastic brotherhood, a dynasty was born, one which's light would reach far beyond the shores of its homeland, to touch continents and centuries yet to come.
The victory at Aljubarrada did more than secure a throne. It transformed the very soul of Portugal. The country, once a patchwork of uncertain loyalties and fragile alliances, now stood united under a single banner, that of King João I, the master of Aviz who had become monarch. His triumph was not merely political, it was deeply spiritual. The people believed that Providence had chosen Portugal anew, that divine favor had passed through the green cross of Aviz and blessed the kingdom's rebirth. In the calm that followed the storm, the land began to heal. The smell of smoke and blood faded from the fields, replaced by the scent of olive and lavender. Villages were rebuilt, and bells once again rang in the chapels and monasteries that had endured the long years of war. In Lisbon, craftsmen returned to their workshops, sailors to their docks, and merchants to their ledgers. Yet beneath the surface of recovery, a quiet transformation was taking shape, one that would lift Portugal from a war-torn frontier to a beacon of ambition and discovery. King João I ruled not as a conqueror, but as a steward of renewal. His reign marked the beginning of the Aviz dynasty, a line that would guide Portugal through an age of unprecedented exploration and cultural flowering. His marriage to Philippa of Lancaster, daughter of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, bound Portugal to England in alliance and friendship. The union brought not only peace, but a blending of minds and traditions that would shape a new vision of kingship. Philippa was wise and devout, a queen whose influence reached far beyond the palace walls. Together, she and João cultivated a court grounded in learning, virtue, and purpose. The royal household became a sanctuary of intellect and faith, where scholars debated theology, astronomers charted the stars, and poets sang of love and valor. Their children would be known to history as a inclita generação, the illustrious generation, a lineage whose deeds would echo across oceans. Within the order that bore his name, João did not forget his roots. Though now king, he continued to favor the brothers of Aviz, elevating their houses and ensuring that their mission evolved alongside the kingdom. The order's lands were expanded, their role redefined. No longer confined to frontier watchtowers, they became advisors, governors, and patrons of the arts and sciences. The sword of the order was now as much a pen as a blade. Its battles fought not against Moors or invaders, but against ignorance and stagnation. The monastery of Aviz itself, once austere and humble, was restored under royal patronage. Its cloisters grew to house not only knights, but scholars and architects. Frescoes adorned its walls, and in its scriptorium, manuscripts of theology and philosophy were copied by careful hands. The green cross, still emblazoned on every tunic, took on new meaning. It was no longer merely a symbol of defense, but of divine inspiration, guiding Portugal toward its destiny. The kingdom's stability brought prosperity, and prosperity awakened curiosity. The Atlantic, once a vast and forbidding horizon, now drew the eyes of mariners and thinkers alike. In the royal court at Lisbon, conversations turned from war to wonder, to the mysteries of distant lands, the possibilities of trade beyond the known seas, and the stars that wheeled above the western horizon. Among those most captivated by this vision was the king's son, Infante Don Enrique, later known as Prince Henry the Navigator. Born into peace, but shaped by the legacy of his father's struggle, Henry carried within him the disciplined spirit of Aviz and the boundless curiosity of a new age. He grew up surrounded by maps, instruments, and tales of travelers who spoke of lands beyond the horizon, lands of gold, spices, and souls yet untouched by Christendom. The king saw in his son the future not of battlefields, but of voyages. Under his guidance, Henry would inherit not just the title of prince, but the grand mastership of the Order of Aviz itself. In this new role, the Order's ancient mission to defend the faith would find a new expression. Its battlefield would no longer be the plains of Iberia, but the uncharted oceans that stretched to the edge of the world. Before that future could unfold, however, Portugal needed time to gather strength. King João I devoted his reign to fortifying the realm, building fleets, strengthening fortresses, and reforming the laws that bound nobles and commoners alike. Trade with England and Flanders flourished, filling Lisbon's harbors with foreign ships. The king's reforms fostered a middle class of merchants and artisans whose wealth would soon fuel the ventures of exploration. In this period of peace, the ideals of chivalry evolved. Chivalry, once measured in blood and steel, began to take on a moral and intellectual character. To be a knight of Aviz was no longer solely to fight, but to serve, through faith, through stewardship, through the pursuit of knowledge. The green cross remained a mark of valor, but also of humility and purpose. As years passed, the court of João I became a symbol of the new Portugal, wise, devout, and forward-looking. The king, though aged and scarred by memory, often spoke of the divine thread that had carried him from the cloisters of Aviz to the throne. He believed that the same providence that had saved Portugal from conquest now called it to a higher purpose. On quiet evenings, when the sun sank behind the towers of Lisbon and the river gleamed like molten gold, João would walk the palace gardens in silence. The scent of rosemary and myrtle filled the air. Sometimes he paused to look westward, toward the Atlantic. He said, "There lies the future of Portugal." And in those words, softly spoken to no one in particular, began the vision that would one day send ships past Cape Bojador, around the coasts of Africa, and across oceans to new worlds. The Order of Aviz, born in secrecy and forged in war, was about to become the vessel of an age. Its green cross would soon be carried not by horsemen across battlefields, but by sailors across waves, a symbol not of resistance, but of discovery. The age of the hidden knights was giving way to the age of the navigators. And in the silence of the monastery that had birthed them, the echoes of prayer would soon blend with the songs of the sea. The morning light upon the Tagus shimmered like molten glass. Ships swayed gently in the harbor, their masts catching the wind, their sails painted with emblems of faith and purpose. Lisbon had grown restless, filled with the hum of carpenters, sailors, and merchants who spoke of the sea as both promise and peril. It was the dawn of a new century, and with it, the slow unfolding of a dream that had first taken root in the heart of the Aviz dynasty, a dream of discovery. Prince Henry, known even in his youth for his contemplative nature, had become the embodiment of this vision. Though he rarely smiled, those who served him spoke of a quiet fire that burned behind his calm eyes, the same fire that had driven his father to secure a kingdom. Yet Henry's gaze did not turn toward Europe's battlefields or courts. His world was the horizon. As Grand Master of the Order of Aviz, Henry inherited not just authority, but a philosophy, the union of devotion and duty. Where his forebears had defended the faith with the sword, he sought to defend it through knowledge, through expansion, through the reach of Portuguese sails into the unknown. Under his leadership,
The order's wealth, lands, and networks would be redirected toward a singular purpose: to explore the seas that stretched beyond the sight of any chart. In Sagres, on the sun-baked promontory of the Algarve, he established what would later be remembered as his school of navigation, though it was not a school in the modern sense, but a gathering of minds. Mariners, cartographers, astronomers, and mathematicians from across Europe converged there, drawn by Henry's patronage and his vision. Together they studied the winds and currents, the stars, and the instruments that could read them. It was a place of prayer as much as of science. Each morning, before the scholars turned to their instruments, the brothers of Aviz would gather in the chapel overlooking the sea. They knelt before the altar where the green cross was carved into stone, and the priest's voice would echo through the still air. May the Lord guide those who traveled the waters as he once guided his people through the desert. The sea had become the new frontier of faith. To Henry and his brothers, each voyage was a pilgrimage, a journey not merely of geography but of spirit. The Atlantic was vast and perilous, its storms unpredictable, its coasts unknown. Yet for those who carried the cross of Aviz, danger was not a deterrent, it was a calling. In 1415, that calling took tangible form. Portuguese ships bearing banners of green and white set sail for the North African coast. Their destination was Ceuta, a fortress city that had long served as a stronghold of Moorish power and trade. For years it had been a gate through which gold, ivory, and slaves passed from Africa into the Mediterranean. To capture it would be to open a new chapter in Portugal's destiny. The expedition was swift and decisive. Under the command of King João I and his sons, including Prince Henry, the Portuguese forces crossed the straits and took the city in a single, relentless assault. The victory at Ceuta marked the first step in Portugal's transformation from a continental kingdom to a maritime empire. For the Order of Aviz, it was a moment of profound significance. The same cross that had flown above the battlements of Aljubarrota now fluttered in the African wind. The knights who once defended the homeland had become the vanguard of expansion. Yet beneath the triumph lay an unease. The conquest of Ceuta was costly, and the city's riches soon proved illusory. Its trade routes shifted, its walls demanded constant defense, and the desert beyond offered no peace. Still, for Prince Henry, the campaign was not a failure, but a revelation. Standing on the ramparts of Ceuta, gazing southward across the sands, he felt the stirrings of a deeper purpose. The true prize, he realized, lay not in the city's markets, but in the lands beyond, lands whose stories reached him in fragments from traders and captives, kingdoms of gold, and rivers that shone like light. Upon his return to Portugal, Henry withdrew to Sagres. There, under the vast sky where the stars of both hemispheres seemed to meet, he began to chart a vision that would define the next century. He gathered maps from Genoese merchants, Arabic treatises on astronomy, and sailors' tales from Madeira and the Canaries. Piece by piece, the edges of the world began to take shape. The Order of Aviz became his silent ally in this pursuit. Its revenues maintained the ports, its influence secured royal backing, and its members provided the discipline and devotion that turned theory into action. Each voyage that left Portugal's shores carried both explorers and brothers, men whose prayers and courage were intertwined. The ships that sailed under the Green Cross were small, their decks crowded, their supplies meager, but in their holds lay the seeds of transformation, compasses, astrolabes, and manuscripts, but also the quiet conviction that faith and discovery could serve one another. By the 1430s, Portuguese sailors had rounded Cape Bojador, long feared as the edge of the world. Beyond it, they found new coasts, barren at first, then fertile, lined with strange plants and darker faces. The chronicles of these journeys spoke not of conquest, but of wonder. The ocean, once a barrier, had become a bridge. In the monasteries of Aviz and Tomar, the news of each voyage was received with solemn joy. The brothers saw in these discoveries the continuation of their ancient vow, to defend and spread the faith, not by war, but by the quiet reach of courage. Prince Henry himself remained largely on Portuguese soil, a contemplative figure at the edge of empire. His hair turned gray, his face weathered by wind and thought, but his mind never rested. Often he would stand upon the cliffs of Sagres at dusk, watching the last light sink into the horizon. There, in that meeting of sea and sky, he found the reflection of his order's purpose, steadfast, searching, and endless. The world was opening. The sea had become scripture, and each wave of verse written by divine hand. And at its center, guiding unseen, the green cross of Aviz continued to glow, not as a relic of the past, but as a compass for the future.
The mid-15th century arrived softly upon Portugal, carried on the scent of salt and cedar, borne by ships returning from lands that few in Europe had imagined were real. Each vessel that glided into Lisbon's harbor brought not only goods and captives, but whispers of the unseen. Coastlines unfurling endlessly southward, stars unfamiliar to northern eyes, and kingdoms whose names would one day fill maps and chronicles. In the cloisters of Aviz, these stories were received not with triumph, but with reverence. The monks and knights of the order listened by candlelight as sailors spoke of strange constellations and rivers that gleamed like mirrors of gold. They transcribed what they could, blending faith with observation, wonder with humility. To them, exploration was not the conquest of nature, but a form of worship, a way to read the vast scripture of creation. Prince Henry, now gray-bearded and contemplative, had become almost monastic in his habits. Though he held no clerical rank, his life mirrored the discipline of the brothers he commanded. He rose before dawn, prayed in silence, and spent his hours among charts and instruments. He corresponded with scholars from Venice, Florence, and even distant Alexandria, seeking wisdom that transcended borders. His mission was not one of empire in the worldly sense, but of enlightenment, to know the breadth of God's creation, and in knowing to serve it. Yet his vision could not remain untouched by the ambitions of kings. King Duarte, Henry's brother and successor to Joan I, understood the value of these explorations, though he worried at their cost. The voyages demanded gold and manpower. The returns were uncertain, the seas unforgiving. In council, Duarte often spoke of prudence, while Henry, standing beside him in his plain robe of Avis green, answered with quiet conviction, "The sea does not reward haste, but faith." It was under Duarte's reign that Portugal began to formalize its maritime enterprise. The Order of Aviz, once a militant brotherhood of knights, became increasingly entwined with the machinery of exploration. Its monasteries provided sanctuary for navigators. Its revenues supported the construction of new ships, carvels, lighter and swifter than those of old. Its brothers, trained in discipline and mathematics, were among the first to learn the art of navigation by the stars. As Portugal's sailors pushed farther along the African coast, they began to encounter not only new lands, but new moral questions. Traders brought back captives, men and women from the coasts of Guinea, sold by rival tribes or taken by force. To many in Europe, such practices were not yet condemned, but among the brothers of Aviz, the sight of chained souls stirred unease. Some chroniclers record that in the monastery of Tomar, a council of the order gathered to debate this new commerce. The older knights argued that it was a necessary burden of expansion, the price of empire. But others, inspired by the teachings of their founders' faith, questioned whether a nation built on bondage could remain truly blessed.
It was said that Prince Henry himself, when presented with captives from one of his voyages, freed many of them, commanding that they be baptized and given sanctuary. Whether this act was born of compassion or policy, it reflected a growing tension between faith and fortune, a tension that would shadow the order and the empire for centuries. The green cross that once symbolized purity and protection was now borne upon ships that carried both missionaries and merchants, both salvation and sorrow. Still, the brothers did not turn away from the sea. They saw in it a reflection of their own dual nature, calm and violent, nurturing and merciless. And so they prayed for guidance. Their psalms rose from the chapels of Aviz and Evora like soft waves breaking against eternity. By mid-century, a new generation had taken the helm of exploration. The younger captains, trained under Henry's influence, had inherited both his discipline and his restlessness. One of them, a quiet navigator named Gil Eons, had already crossed Cape Bojador, once believed to be the very edge of the world, proving that the ocean did not end in darkness. His success marked a shift in Europe's imagination. The map was no longer bound by myth. In 1441, Nuno Tristan sailed farther still, reaching the shores of modern-day Senegal. His expedition brought back news of vast rivers and forests teeming with life. Soon after, Dinis Diaz discovered Cape Verde, naming it for its verdant cliffs. Each journey, however small, was recorded with care by the brothers of Aviz, who maintained the order's chronicles in a tone not of conquest, but of devotion. As Henry aged, his world grew both larger and smaller. Larger in the sense that the maps before him filled with new coastlines and islands, smaller because he rarely left Sagres. His companions dwindled, his family faded into memory, yet he remained steadfast, a solitary figure standing between two eras, the medieval and the modern, the cloister and the cosmos. In 1460, as winter drew near, the prince's health began to fail. He would spend his final days in quiet prayer, his gaze turned westward toward the setting sun. Those who attended him said that he spoke little, though one of his last utterances was a whisper of gratitude, for the sea, for his brothers, and for the path that faith had drawn upon the waters. When he died, the bells of Sagres tolled slowly across the cliffs. His body was carried to Batalha, where it was laid among kings, but his spirit lingered in the winds that brushed the sails of every departing ship. The men who had served under him, captains, scholars, and brothers of Aviz, would continue his mission, not out of ambition, but out of quiet duty. The age of discoveries had begun in earnest, and with it the transformation of Portugal from a small, devout kingdom to the axis of a vast and shifting world. The green cross of Aviz, once the symbol of knights who guarded the homeland, now guided explorers through storms and stars. The sea, once feared, had become the nation's cathedral, boundless, mysterious, and divine. And in every horizon they sought not only new lands, but the reflection of the eternal, the same flame that had kindled within the hidden knights of Aviz centuries before.
The death of Prince Henry marked not an end, but a transformation. The sea did not pause in mourning. It continued to whisper against Portugal's shores, beckoning ships toward horizons that grew more defined with each passing year. The torch that had burned in Sagres now passed quietly into other hands. Men who had studied his maps, prayed in his chapels, and dreamed beneath the same Atlantic sky. By the latter half of the 15th century, the influence of the Order of Aviz had woven itself so completely into the kingdom's identity that one could scarcely tell where the monastery ended and the state began. Its green cross adorned the sails of ships, the walls of fortresses, and the cloaks of captains. Its members, though fewer in number, remained powerful in spirit. Guardians of Portugal's destiny, now expressed not through battlefields, but through voyages of faith and trade. King Afonso V, known as the African, was the first monarch to truly inherit Henry's maritime legacy. Under his reign, Portugal's expeditions pushed deeper along the West African coast, reaching lands rich with gold and human life. Forts were established at Argan and Elmina,
their walls built from stone and prayer alike. From these outposts, caravels fanned outward, mapping the great curve of the continent. The Order of Aviz, still holding vast estates and spiritual authority, lent its blessing to these endeavors. Monks recorded each new discovery as both a triumph of reason and a revelation of divine design. But within the halls of Aviz, the quiet debates that had begun under Henry grew louder. The moral cost of empire weighed heavily upon some of its brothers. Letters from this period reveal a subtle unease. One abbot wrote that we sail ever farther from our shores, yet perhaps also from our souls. Others defended the voyages as a means to spread the light of Christianity, to lift the heathen from darkness into grace. Between these two visions, compassion and conquest, the order walked a narrow path. Amid this tension rose a new figure, João, Duke of Viseu, nephew of Afonso V and Grand Master of the Order of Aviz. Though less celebrated than Prince Henry, João was a man of quiet intelligence and deep piety. He reorganized the order's structure, ensuring that its revenues sustained not only exploration, but also hospitals, orphanages, and schools. Under his guidance, the Green Cross came to symbolize not merely valor, but service, a return, in part, to its spiritual roots. Yet even João could not resist the currents of empire. As Portugal's ships reached farther south, new riches flowed into Lisbon, gold from Guinea, spices from the islands, and captives from the coasts. The city became a living mosaic of languages and faces, its markets humming with the promise of global trade. The brothers of Aviz, once bound to the simplicity of the cloister, found themselves walking among the splendors and contradictions of a new world. In 1498, a name was spoken in the refectories of every monastery: Bartolomé Diaz. Sailing under the royal banner and, as ever, beneath the green cross, Diaz had done what no European before him had dared. He had rounded the southernmost tip of Africa, the Cape of Storms, later renamed the Cape of Good Hope. With this, the path to India lay open. The news reached Lisbon like a hymn. Bells rang in the cathedrals, and the brothers of Aviz knelt in prayer, thanking God for guiding their nation so far. To them, Diaz's voyage was not a triumph of human will alone, but a manifestation of divine providence, the continuation of a sacred journey that had begun with the knights who once defended Portugal's borders. But the world they had entered was not of peace. The seas that once held mystery now held competition. Spain, newly unified under Ferdinand and Isabella, had turned its gaze westward. Rivalries deepened, and the papal court in Rome sought to divide the unknown world between the Iberian crowns. In 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas was signed, its lines drawn across the globe, an invisible meridian granting Portugal dominion over lands to the east and Spain over those to the west. Few at the time could comprehend what those lines meant. Fewer still could foresee that they would one day stretch from Brazil to Timor, from the mouth of the Amazon to the shores of Japan. Amid this growing empire, the spirit of Aviz evolved once more. The monasteries of Aviz became way stations for missionaries preparing to sail to Africa, India, and beyond. Its symbols adorned the standards of explorers like Vasco da Gama, whose 1498 voyage to Calicut fulfilled Prince Henry's vision, uniting Europe and Asia across the sea. Da Gama's fleet carried both the sword and the crucifix. On their sails, the green cross of Aviz fluttered beside the royal arms of Portugal. The chroniclers who described his arrival in India spoke of awe and wonder, but also of confrontation. For with discovery came demand, for spices, for converts, for power. The order, once founded to defend the faith, now found itself entangled in the faith's expansion. Missionaries preached on foreign shores, their words sometimes welcomed, sometimes resisted. The sea became a frontier not only of geography, but of conscience. By the dawn of the 16th century, Portugal had become a nation of two souls. One remained humble,
monastic, prayerful, the legacy of Aviz. The other burned with ambition, gilded by empire and wealth. Between them stretched a tension as vast as the ocean itself. In the monastery of Aviz, the elder brothers often sat in silence, listening to the distant roar of the sea carried by the wind. They spoke of their founder, of Prince Henry, and of the early days when the order had been small, hidden, and pure. They did not begrudge the age of discovery, but they understood that every discovery is also a departure, a leaving behind of something sacred. Still, the cross endured. It was carved into the decks of ships, painted on maps, and worn by men who never forgot the vows of those who came before them. Even as Portugal's influence spread across continents, the heart of Aviz remained where it had always been, in the quiet contemplation of duty and faith. For centuries to come, that balance between worldly glory and spiritual purpose would define both the order and the empire it helped create. And though the seas would change, though the empire would rise and fall, the cross of Aviz would remain a silent witness to it all, a symbol of courage and conscience, steadfast in the shifting tides of time.
The 16th century unfolded over Portugal like a golden dawn, brilliant, vast, and dazzling in its reach. The name of Aviz, once whispered in the cloisters of a humble order, now echoed across oceans. The knights who had once guarded the frontiers of a fledgling kingdom had become patrons of a global realm. Yet within this splendor, shadows lingered, quiet reminders that all empires, no matter how divine their beginnings, carry the weight of mortality. King Manuel I, who ascended the throne in 1495, was a monarch shaped by destiny. He was called the Fortunate, for his reign coincided with discoveries that transformed Portugal into a maritime superpower. It was under his command that Vasco da Gama's fleet completed its voyage to India, opening the sea route to the east. The spices, silks, and jewels that once took years to reach Europe now flowed directly into Lisbon's harbors. The city blossomed into a crossroads of the world, its air thick with incense and ambition. But amid this rise, the Order of Aviz, once the spiritual heart of the realm, began to change in subtle, irreversible ways. Its sacred vows, once strict and austere, softened under royal favor. Many of its knights now held estates, commanded fleets, or served in the court. Their prayers mingled with the hum of commerce, and the echo of sword against shield was replaced by the rustle of parchment and coin. The order's monasteries, however, remained sanctuaries of contemplation. In the quiet chambers of Aviz, Tomar, and Évora, the elder brothers still followed their ancient rhythm: prayer at dawn, work at midday, silence at dusk. They watched from afar as the world their order had helped to create expanded beyond imagination. Their thoughts turned not to conquest, but to the meaning of service, to the question of what it truly meant to defend the faith in an age of empire. King Manuel I himself was deeply connected to the legacy of Aviz. Through his lineage, he was a descendant of its founders, and he embraced its symbolism as both spiritual guide and political emblem. The green cross adorned his royal standards, stitched into the sails of ships bound for India, Africa, and the newly discovered lands across the Atlantic. To the sailors who journeyed under that emblem, it was more than a mark of nationhood. It was a talisman of divine protection. Lisbon became a city of marvels. The new Jeronimos monastery rose on the banks of the Tagus, its cloisters carved in delicate stone lace, blending Gothic devotion with maritime imagery. Every column bore symbols of the sea: ropes, shells, coral, and waves, as though the ocean itself had been turned to stone in reverence. The monastery was built not only as a house of prayer, but as a monument to the discoveries made under the light of the Aviz cross. Yet behind this grandeur the moral compass of empire began to waver. The pursuit of trade and conversion intertwined with conquest and exploitation. The same caravels that carried missionaries to foreign shores returned laden with wealth and human cargo. The Order's chroniclers, once the keepers of Portugal's spiritual conscience, found their voices muted amid the triumphal songs of exploration. Still, there were those within the Brotherhood who saw clearly. One anonymous monk, writing from the monastery of Évora around 1510, reflected, "We have traded our cloisters for caravels, our silence for the roar of cannon. The cross we bear is holy, but the hands that raise it are stained with worldly desire. May God forgive our blindness, for we have sought his glory in the depths of gold and spice." The words were never meant for kings, but they revealed the quiet turmoil that stirred beneath Portugal's shining surface. The spirit of Aviz, born from humility and devotion, was being tested by prosperity. As Portugal's fleets pushed ever farther, to Mozambique, to Goa, to Malacca, and finally to the distant islands of Japan, the green cross of Aviz became a familiar sight in ports half a world away. It appeared on fortresses overlooking tropical seas, on banners fluttering above foreign cathedrals, and on the robes of priests who preached in languages once not known to Europe. The Order's influence now stretched from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean, yet its heart remained curiously still. The discipline of its earliest brothers had been forged in hardship, in the defense of a fragile kingdom surrounded by enemies. Now, surrounded instead by abundance, the Order found itself adrift in a sea of its own success. In 1521, Manuel I died, and the crown passed to his son João III. Under João's rule, Portugal's empire reached its greatest territorial extent. He was a devout monarch, serious and introspective, who sought to restore the moral foundation of the realm. It was he who brought the Jesuits to Portugal, a new order of priests whose vigor and learning rekindled the spirit of missionary work abroad. For the older brothers of Aviz, this was both a blessing and a challenge. They recognized in the Jesuits a reflection of their own origins, zeal tempered by obedience, intellect guided by faith. But they also sensed that the torch of spiritual leadership was passing to new hands. The Aviz order, though still honored, was no longer the beating heart of Portugal's conscience. It had become part of the realm's heritage, respected, but fading into ceremony. In the coastal monasteries where the cries of gulls mingled with the sound of evening bells, the brothers continued their rituals. They prayed for the sailors who ventured into unknown waters, for the missionaries who faced storms and swords, and for the souls caught between faith and empire. Their prayers were not for conquest, but for clarity, that the light of God, which once guided their swords, might yet guide the nation's heart. And though they did not know it, the tide was already turning. Empires, like the sea, are governed by rhythms beyond mortal control. For every crest of triumph, there is an ebb of loss. The green cross of Aviz, shining proudly across the oceans, would time one day be tested by storms no compass could predict. But for now, in the early 15th century, Portugal stood at the height of its power, and the order that had once fought to protect its infancy had become the quiet soul of its maturity. The Knights of Aviz were no longer warriors of the sword, but keepers of memory, their silence carrying the weight of 1,000 voyages and prayers whispered across the centuries.
The 16th century, once radiant with promise, began to darken at its edges. Beneath the gilded sunlight of empire, shadows deepened, subtle at first, then unmistakable. The Order of Aviz, once the luminous heart of Portugal's faith and discipline,
now moved through quieter corridors. The echoes of prayer within its cloisters carried a somber tone, as though the brothers sensed that the tide which had borne their nation to greatness was beginning to turn. King Zhao III, though pious and deliberate, ruled in an age of exhaustion disguised as triumph. The discoveries of the previous century had enriched Portugal beyond imagining, yet they had also stretched its resources thin. Fortresses and colonies demanded men and gold, while the sea exacted its endless toll in lives. The grandeur of Lisbon, newly adorned with churches and marble palaces, hid a growing weariness in the hearts of its people. In this world, the Order of Aviz stood as both witness and relic. Its green cross still gleamed on the uniforms of officers, its name invoked in oaths and ceremonies. But the brotherhood itself had grown quieter. Many of its lands were leased to the crown or to noble families. Its monasteries remained places of learning and prayer, but fewer young men joined its ranks. The age of knights had faded into memory, replaced by merchants, scholars, and sailors. Still, the spirit of Aviz endured, not in arms, but in conscience. The brothers had turned their attention inward to contemplation and service. They maintained hospitals for the poor, taught the children of fishermen to read and write, and tended to the sick who came seeking comfort. Their monasteries, once fortresses of defense, had become sanctuaries of healing. In the early years of Zhao's reign, Lisbon became the seat of a growing inquisition. Fear crept into the alleys and markets, carried on whispers of heresy and suspicion. Faith, once the order's guiding flame, was now wielded by others as an instrument of power. The brothers of Aviz, bound by ancient vows of humility, watched this transformation with sorrow. They remembered the days when faith had been a shield, not a chain. Outside Portugal, the empire expanded still, to Brazil, to Africa, to the islands of the Indian Ocean. Jesuits, Franciscans, and Dominicans carried the cross into distant lands. The green cross of Aviz appeared beside them, now more as symbol than order, its meaning absorbed into the greater tapestry of Portugal's imperial faith. And yet, within the order's archives, a few monks continued the work that had begun centuries earlier, the careful recording of history. Their quills traced not just the deeds of kings and explorers, but the quiet truths that rarely reached the chronicles of power. They wrote of the fishermen of Setúbal who prayed to the Virgin each morning before casting their nets, of the widows who came to the monastery gates seeking bread, of the sailors who carried small wooden crosses, carved in the shape of the Aviz emblem, as talismans against the sea. These were the true heirs of the order's legacy, the humble, the faithful, the unseen. In them, the old spirit survived, the belief that service to God was not found in conquest, but in compassion. In 1557, Zhao III died, leaving a kingdom burdened by both glory and fragility. His successor, young King Sebastian, ascended the throne as a boy. From childhood, he was captivated by tales of the crusading knights of Aviz, their courage, their purity, their divine purpose. To the aging brothers who still remember the old days, he seemed almost like an echo of the past, a monarch born from the order's very soul. Sebastian grew to embody the romantic ideal of a warrior king. He trained in arms, studied scripture, and dreamed of restoring Portugal's holy reputation through battle. The monks of Aviz prayed for him daily, their chants echoing through the halls as though pleading with heaven to temper the fervor that burned within him. But faith, when bound too tightly to destiny, can lead men astray. The young king saw himself
not merely as ruler, but as redeemer. Against the counsel of his elders, he prepared an expedition to North Africa, determined to strike at the Muslim kingdoms beyond the sea. He believed that victory there would revive the chivalric glory of old, the age when the Knights of Aviz had defended Christendom with honor and fire. In the summer of 1578, King Sebastian led his army across the straits to Morocco. With him rode nobles, priests, and adventurers, a crusade born not of necessity, but of nostalgia. The green cross of Aviz flew once more above the Portuguese host, fluttering proudly in the desert wind. But the campaign ended in catastrophe. At Alcácer Quibir, beneath a sun that burned without mercy, the Portuguese army was surrounded and annihilated. The young king vanished in battle, his body never found. In the silence that followed, Portugal's faith cracked like a mirror. News of the disaster reached Lisbon slowly, borne by the few survivors who returned. The brothers of Aviz gathered in their chapels to pray for the soul of their fallen king, but they knew the truth. An era had ended. The last echo of their chivalric dream had perished in the sands of Africa. In the years that followed, the kingdom faltered. With no heir, the throne passed to Philip II of Spain, and Portugal entered a period of foreign rule. The once proud banner of Aviz, symbol of independence and divine favor, now hung in shadow. And yet, within the monasteries, the brothers endured. They continued to pray, to teach, to heal. They spoke little of politics or loss. Their faith was older than kings, older than empires. In the stillness of evening, as the sun dipped beyond the Atlantic, they would light candles before the green cross and whisper the same words that had guided them for centuries. What is hidden shall endure. For the legacy of Aviz was not measured in crowns or battles, but in the quiet constancy of belief, the understanding that even when nations fall, faith can remain, steadfast and unseen. And though the world beyond their walls had changed beyond recognition, the Order's soul, that secret flame of devotion and duty, still flickered in the dim light of their chapels, awaiting the dawn that history, in its long turning, would one day bring again.
When dawn broke over Portugal in the early 17th century, it rose upon a land not entirely its own. For 60 years, the crown of Portugal rested in Madrid, its kings foreign, its sovereignty diluted. Yet even in subjugation, something subtle endured, a memory, a pulse that refused to fade. The Order of Aviz, stripped of its former grandeur, lingered like a sacred ember in the ashes of independence. Its monasteries remained standing, weathered by time, but still tended by the faithful. Its brothers continued to wear the green cross, though few now remembered what it had once meant. They prayed for the kingdom's soul, for the quiet restoration of its destiny, and for the day when Portuguese voices would again rule Portuguese lands. In this subdued age, their prayers were whispered, not shouted. The order no longer commanded armies or built fortresses. It now lived in contemplation, in endurance. In the evenings, as candlelight flickered along the cloistered halls, the old knights, now aged priests, would speak softly of past glories. They spoke of the Templars who had come before them, of Vows the Master who became king, and of the green cross that once fluttered proudly across the seas. Their words were not of conquest, but of memory, an unbroken thread binding them to the heart of Portugal itself. Yet beyond their walls, the people began to stir. Farmers, nobles, merchants, all carried within them a yearning for sovereignty. The Spanish rule had brought wealth and peace to some, but to others it was a silence too deep, a submission too bitter. It was within this quiet unrest that a spark ignited in 1640. On a cold December morning, conspirators gathered in Lisbon's palace. Their cause was not born of ambition, but of remembrance. The same remembrance kept alive in the hearts of the brothers of Aviz. They struck swiftly, overthrowing the Spanish governor and proclaiming a new king, João, Duke of Braganza, descendant of the ancient line of Aviz. When news reached the monasteries, bells rang for the first time in generations with unrestrained joy. Across Portugal, the sound echoed through valleys and across the sea, carrying a message long suppressed: the kingdom was free again. In the chapel of Aviz, the brothers assembled in solemn prayer. They lit candles beneath the green cross and recited psalms of thanksgiving. For them, the restoration of independence was not merely political, it was spiritual. They saw in King João IV the resurrection of their founder's legacy, the rebirth of a nation forged in faith. João IV himself understood the power of symbols. He revived the ancient orders of chivalry, Santiago, Christ, and Aviz, binding them anew to the crown. The Order of Aviz was reconstituted as a royal order of merit, its Grand Master now the king himself. Though its vows of poverty and obedience were softened, its emblem once more gleamed upon the uniforms of officers and the walls of state halls. For a time, it seemed as if the past had returned, transfigured. The green cross fluttered again in parades, in royal ceremonies, and upon the standards of regiments defending Portugal's reborn independence. It was no longer the mark of monastic warriors, but of loyal servants, soldiers, sailors, and statesmen united under a shared history. In the countryside, the old monasteries of Aviz regained purpose. Some became schools, others barracks or hospitals. The monks who remained saw this transformation with mixed hearts. They had long prayed for Portugal's renewal, yet the world that emerged was one where their contemplative way of life had little place. Faith, once a living fire, had become more measured, more ceremonial. Still, they tended their gardens, copied manuscripts, and kept watch over the relics of their founders. Rusted swords, fragments of armor, faded parchments bearing the seals of kings. Each object, humble though it seemed, was a vessel of memory. In these relics they found meaning, reminders that history was not merely a chronicle of events, but a succession of souls. The 17th century gave way to the 18th, and Portugal, though free, bore the weight of modernity. The age of enlightenment dawned across Europe, bringing with it questions that even faith could not easily answer. The world no longer sought salvation through knighthood or divine mission. It sought reason, discovery, and progress. Within the quiet walls of the order, these changes were felt like distant tremors. Young novices studied Latin and scripture, but also mathematics and philosophy. The green cross of Aviz still adorned their robes, though few of them would ever wield a sword. The age of crusades was long gone. Their battles were of spirit and intellect now. In 1755, a great earthquake struck Lisbon. The city burned for days and the sea swallowed entire districts. Monasteries crumbled, libraries vanished, and thousands perished. Among the ruins, the brothers of Aviz tended to the wounded, offering what little shelter they could. They buried the dead, prayed for the living, and watched the capital rise again from the ashes. It was said by some that the quake was divine punishment, by others, a mere act of nature. But for the order, it was a lesson in humility. The might of empires, the brilliance of reason, all could be undone in a moment. Only faith, however small, could endure such ruin. In the decades that followed, the winds of reform swept through Portugal. Queen Maria I, wise and devout, sought to modernize the kingdom while honoring its traditions. In 1789, she restructured the Order of Aviz, transforming it into a secular order of merit. The monastic vows were dissolved. The brothers became officers of the crown. It was the final metamorphosis. The green cross remained, but its meaning shifted once again. No longer a sign of holy war, nor even of cloistered devotion, but of national service. The warrior monks of the past had become symbols of courage and virtue in the modern state. And yet within the fading monasteries, a few aged friars still lingered. They rose each morning before dawn, as their forebears had done, to sing the same prayers that had echoed through the centuries. Their voices, thin and wavering, filled the empty chapels with a ghostly music, the sound of time itself remembering. In them the true heart of Aviz endured, quiet, steadfast, and unbroken. For though kingdoms rise and fall, though empires blaze and fade into dust, the spirit that began in secrecy and faith never truly dies. It simply changes form, waiting for those who will remember. And so the night of Portugal's long history deepened, filled with silence and stars. Somewhere in the Alentejo plains, the ruins of Aviz still stood, their stones warm beneath the moonlight, their shadows whispering of nights long vanished, whose dreams still shaped the soul of a nation. By the dawn of the 19th century, Portugal stood again at a crossroads, neither wholly ancient nor entirely modern. The empire that had once stretched across oceans was fraying, its golden threads unraveling beneath the weight of wars, revolutions, and shifting tides of thought. Yet amid these upheavals, the green cross of Aviz still glimmered faintly, a relic from a quieter time, its meaning continually reshaped by each generation that bore it. The Napoleonic Wars cast a long shadow across Europe, and Portugal, bound by alliance to Britain, soon found itself drawn into the maelstrom. When French troops marched across its borders in 1807, the royal family fled across the Atlantic to Brazil. Lisbon fell silent, its harbor empty save for the echo of departing sails. Within the old monasteries of Aviz, the bells tolled low and mournful. The brothers, their numbers diminished, prayed for the safety of their king and for the endurance of their homeland. In that moment, the ancient connection between the Order of Aviz and the Portuguese crown took on a new dimension. For centuries, the Order's Grand Master had been the sovereign himself, a union of throne and cross. Now, as the monarchy lived in exile, the symbol of Aviz became a thread that tied the two halves of the kingdom together, one in Europe, one in the New World. It was said that the royal standard in Rio de Janeiro still bore the green cross upon its fabric, a quiet pledge that Portugal, though scattered, remained whole in spirit. The brothers who stayed behind endured the hardships of occupation. Some were forced from their monasteries as French soldiers requisitioned the buildings for barracks or stables. Yet even then they continued their silent ministries, tending the wounded, hiding refugees, and preserving sacred relics from desecration. In small acts of compassion, they kept alive the essence of what the Order of Aviz had always stood for: faithfulness amid chaos, service amid suffering. When the French were finally driven out and King John VI returned from Brazil in 1821, he found a country changed. The old structures of authority trembled beneath the weight of new ideas: liberty, equality, constitutional rule. The world that had once revered divine order now demanded representation and reform.
The monarch's own experience abroad had softened him, and he sought compromise where others demanded absolutes. The Order of Aviz, by now a royal order of merit, reflected this delicate balance. It honored not only nobles and generals, but also men of learning, exploration, and public virtue. Its recipients were not bound by vows, but by duty, citizens who served the nation through intellect or courage. The Cross of Aviz thus became both decoration and reminder, a link to Portugal's medieval soul in an age that increasingly defined itself by progress. But peace was fleeting. After Jean VI's death, Portugal descended into civil war. Two brothers, Pedro and Miguel, each claimed the throne, dividing the nation between liberal and absolutist visions of the future. The conflict tore families apart, turned neighbors into enemies, and once again filled the land with the smoke of battle. In this fratricidal struggle, the old orders of chivalry seemed like ghosts from another world. Yet the name of Aviz still carried weight. Officers loyal to both sides bore its cross on their breastplates, invoking the memory of unity even as they fought under divided banners. For all their differences, both claimed to defend the true legacy of Portugal and, in their own ways, the spirit of Aviz. When the war ended in 1834 with the triumph of the liberal cause, the final remnants of monastic life in Portugal were swept away. Religious orders were dissolved, their lands nationalized, their members scattered. The monasteries that had stood for centuries fell silent at last. Some became schools, others prisons, others simply ruins reclaimed by ivy and time. The brothers of Aviz, who had once guarded the frontier, prayed for kings, and blessed ships bound for distant seas, were no more. Their manuscripts were taken to state archives, their relics placed in museums. To many, they were now part of the past, romantic figures consigned to history's long twilight. Yet the green cross endured. The state, recognizing the order's deep symbolic power, retained it as a military decoration. Soldiers who distinguished themselves in battle were awarded the insignia of the Order of Aviz, not as monks or crusaders, but as patriots. It became a mark of valor, a thread linking modern heroes to their medieval forebears. In time, the order's presence extended even beyond the army. Scholars, explorers, and public servants received it in recognition of merit. The cross, once carried on shields and painted on sails, now gleamed on medals pinned to the chests of men who fought with pen and compass rather than sword. Through all these transformations, one truth remained. The spirit of Aviz adapted but never vanished. Like the kingdom that it had helped to build, it survived by changing, by bending with the winds of time while holding fast to its roots. By the mid-19th century, as Portugal entered the modern age, the name Aviz had become part of its collective memory, neither wholly sacred nor entirely secular. It was the sound of bells in a ruined cloister, the shimmer of green enamel on a soldier's uniform, the faint echo of prayer woven into the national anthem's pride. And though no one could trace its lineage back through the centuries, something of the order's essence remained in the Portuguese character, a quiet courage, a steadfast faith, and a belief that even in the smallest acts of duty, one served something greater than oneself. So the centuries turned, and the order that began in secrecy under a distant king now existed only as symbol, a memory made tangible, a bridge between the age of crusaders and the age of nations. Yet in the Alentejo, where the plains stretched golden beneath the sun, the stones of the old convent at Aviz still stood. Shepherds passed by without knowing the histories those walls had witnessed. But on still nights, when the wind carried across the fields, it was said one could hear faintly the echo of bells and the soft murmur of men at prayer, guardians unseen,
keeping watch over the land they had once sworn to defend. The 19th century rolled onward, restless and uncertain, carrying Portugal into the age of industry, revolution, and empire's slow unraveling. The world was changing at a pace few could understand. Steamships replaced caravels, telegraphs replaced messengers, and the map of Europe shifted like sand beneath a rising tide. Through it all, the green cross of Aviz persisted, a quiet emblem carried not by monks or knights, but by soldiers and statesmen who scarcely remembered its ancient vows. By the 1850s, Portugal was a kingdom at once proud and weary. The liberal reforms that had dissolved the monasteries and secularized the old orders had also eroded much of the spiritual cohesion that had once bound the nation together. The old cathedrals still stood, their bells tolling across empty squares, but faith had taken on a quieter, more private form. The Order of Aviz, now wholly a military order of merit, continued its slow transformation from a brotherhood of the soul to a decoration of the state. Its insignia was awarded to officers for distinguished service, a symbol of honor, discipline, and loyalty to the crown. But within the walls of Lisbon's ministries, where bureaucrats and generals gathered, few remembered that it had once been born from the ashes of the Templars, or that its earliest members had taken vows beneath the open sky of battle. Still, there were those who felt the echo of the past. In libraries and archives, historians began to rediscover the manuscripts of the medieval orders. They read of João, master of Aviz, who became the savior of Portugal, of Prince Henry, who turned the order's wealth toward the sea, of the knights who had stood guard at the frontiers when the nation was still young. For them, the order's history was not merely legend, it was a key to understanding how Portugal had become what it was. As the century advanced, new storms gathered. Across Europe, monarchies trembled before the winds of republicanism. Empires faced revolts in their colonies. The very idea of divine kingship seemed to wane, replaced by the will of the people and the rule of law. Yet in Portugal, the monarchy endured, fragile, reformed, but still adorned with the symbols of its medieval heritage. The green cross of Aviz, emblazoned upon royal orders and military banners, stood as one of those quiet symbols, neither political nor partisan, but deeply national. King Pedro V, who ascended the throne in 1853, embodied the contradictions of this age. A man of science and progress, he also held a reverence for history. He saw in the old orders a living link between Portugal's past and its moral character. Under his reign, the Order of Aviz regained a measure of dignity. He commissioned restorations of ruined monasteries and encouraged scholars to publish the chronicles of medieval Portugal. But fate was cruel. The young king, beloved by his people, died of typhoid fever in 1861. His brother Luis succeeded him, ruling with steadiness through decades of quiet decay. The world beyond Portugal surged ahead. Railways, telegraphs, and global trade reshaped Europe's fortunes, yet the small Atlantic kingdom seemed caught between nostalgia and necessity. Through all of this, the green cross continued to appear in moments of service and sacrifice. Portuguese soldiers carried it in Africa and Asia, in far-flung colonial posts where the heat was fierce and the nights silent. There, amid the dust and loneliness of empire, it took on a new meaning, not as a relic of crusading zeal, but as a reminder of endurance. In 1890, a crisis erupted. Britain, once Portugal's oldest ally, issued an ultimatum demanding that Portuguese forces withdraw from disputed territories in southern Africa. The humiliation shook the nation to its core. In cafes and parliament halls, men spoke bitterly of decline and betrayal. Some pointed to the Order of Aviz, once a symbol of courage, and asked what had become of its spirit. Yet others found in it a quiet consolation. They believed that symbols endure because they outlast failure. The green cross, after all, had survived wars, exiles, and earthquakes.
it would survive this too. By the turn of the 20th century, Portugal stood on the edge of another transformation. Discontent simmered beneath the veneer of monarchy. The royal family, still proud heirs of the House of Braganza and the Aviz legacy, faced growing opposition from republicans and reformers who saw the crown as an artifact of the past. In 1908, tragedy struck once more. King Carlos I and his heir, Prince Luís Felipe, were assassinated in Lisbon's Praça de Comércio. The city, once radiant with empire's confidence, fell silent under morning skies. The green cross of Aviz, emblazoned upon royal regalia, was seen draped in black, a symbol of loyalty to a dynasty now nearing its end. 2 years later, the monarchy was abolished. Portugal became a republic, its flag remade, its symbols rewritten. The royal orders were suspended, their privileges revoked, and for the first time in 6 centuries, the green cross of Aviz ceased to belong to the realm of power. And yet, like so much in Portugal's history, it did not disappear. Veterans still wore it on their uniforms, historians still traced its lineage, and in the quiet of old churches, where sunlight filtered through dust and silence, the image of the green cross could still be found carved in stone. It had become something deeper than a royal emblem. It was a mirror of Portugal itself, resilient, weathered, enduring. From crusades to colonies, from monasteries to republics, it had borne witness to every chapter of the nation's long journey. Now, in the twilight of empire and the dawn of modernity, the Order of Aviz awaited its next transformation. No longer an order of monks or kings, it rested in the hands of history itself, a story too deeply woven into Portugal's soul to be erased, waiting quietly for its rediscovery. And in the ancient town of Aviz, where all had begun, the ruins of the old convent still caught the evening sun. The stones glowed faintly green and gold, as if remembering the robes of the knights who once walked there, men who believed that service was sacred and that in every act of duty the divine could still be found.
The 20th century dawned over Portugal not with triumph, but with uncertainty. The bells that had once tolled for kings now rang for republics. The cross that had once blessed royal banners now lingered in the quiet corners of memory. And yet, even as regimes rose and fell, the essence of the Order of Aviz, that faint green flame of service and faith, refused to die. It simply waited, as it always had, for history's next breath. In the early years of the Portuguese Republic, the state sought to cast off the remnants of monarchy. Royal orders were declared obsolete, their insignia stripped from uniforms, their titles erased from law. Monasteries were closed, and the symbols of chivalry were dismissed as relics of superstition and privilege. The new government envisioned a nation reborn in reason and civic virtue, free from the weight of the past. But Portugal's past was not so easily erased. The people, even those who embraced modern ideals, carried within them a quiet affection for the symbols that had shaped their collective story. The cross of Aviz, in particular, held a peculiar endurance. It was neither entirely religious nor wholly royal, neither political nor partisan. It was, in its essence, Portuguese, steadfast, simple, enduring. In the fields and villages, older veterans of the colonial campaigns still polished their medals bearing the green cross. To them, it was not an emblem of monarchy, but of duty, of the long line of soldiers who had served their country, no matter its form of government. And though the Republic had dissolved the orders in law, the people kept them alive in spirit. By the 1920s, the Portuguese Republic trembled under the strain of division. Coups and counter-coups followed one another in dizzying succession.
The country seemed unable to find its balance, caught between the dreams of modernity and the ghosts of its past. In this atmosphere of uncertainty, the old symbols began to re-emerge, not as royal ornaments, but as threads of continuity, reminders that Portugal's identity stretched far deeper than politics. When the Estado Novo, the new state, rose under Antonio de Oliveira Salazar in the 1930s, it sought to root itself in tradition. Salazar's government drew heavily upon Portugal's medieval and imperial imagery to forge a narrative of national unity. The Cross of Aviz, alongside the armillary sphere and the Cross of Christ, returned to prominence as emblems of patriotism and order. In 1918, years before Salazar's rule, the military Order of Aviz had been officially revived by the state, this time as a secular honor, granted for distinguished military service. The old vows were long gone, the monasteries empty, but the order lived on in the hearts of soldiers. By decree, the green cross once again adorned medals and insignia, its color slightly deepened to reflect the new age.
The convent of Aviz stands today like a half-remembered dream, its stones weathered by 700 winters, its corridors silent save for the hum of wind and bees. The old cloister, once alive with the chant of warrior monks, is now the haunt of sunlight and dust. Grass grows between the paving stones, and swallows trace circles above the green cross carved into the archway. Time has worn its sharp edges smooth, but the symbol endures as if refusing to be forgotten. When one stands there in the golden light of Alentejo's afternoon, history feels less like something that happened and more like something still breathing. The air carries whispers of vows long spoken, poverty, chastity, obedience, and service. The brothers of Aviz may be gone, but their purpose lingers, folded into the identity of a nation that once looked to them for its soul. In modern Portugal, the Order of Aviz is no longer a secret brotherhood or an instrument of empire. It is an honor, a decoration of service and courage, granted to soldiers who embody the discipline and quiet strength of those early knights. The ceremony is simple now. There are no processions, no masses sung in Latin, no swords raised in holy cause. The President of the Republic, standing before the flag, pins the green cross upon a uniform. The moment is brief, but the lineage it carries is vast. Few of those who receive it know the full arc of the story, that their medal traces its ancestry to the hidden Templars of Portugal, that its green cross was first drawn by monks who believed their swords were instruments of God's will. But the spirit beneath the symbol remains. It is a faith not in dogma, but in duty, a conviction that to serve with integrity, to act with courage when no one is watching, is itself a form of prayer. In the quiet halls of Lisbon's military museums, the legacy of the order is preserved in glass cases. There, side by side, rest the banners of the medieval knights, the ornate insignia of empire, and the modern medals of the Republic. The progression is almost poetic, a visual timeline of Portugal's transformation from faith to reason, from monarchy to democracy, from crusade to conscience. And yet, if one looks closely, something constant shines through. Across all centuries, across all changes of power and purpose, the green cross persists, always green, always steady, always the same. It is the color of rebirth, of endurance, of the land itself. It is the color of the fields of Aviz, where it all began. In the 21st century, as Portugal faces new challenges, no longer battles of sword or empire, but struggles of identity in a global age, the Order of Aviz has taken on a new meaning. It is now a reminder of continuity, a thread binding the present to the distant past. In the language of the state, it honors distinguished military merit, but in the language of history, it honors something older, the idea that service to one's people is sacred even in silence. Sometimes during national ceremonies, the order's insignia catch the light on a soldier's chest. In that flash of green and gold, the centuries fold together, Templars and explorers, kings and republics, monks and mariners. It is as though the entire history of Portugal, its courage, its faith, its restlessness, has condensed into a single gleam of color. There is a kind of poetry in that endurance, for though the order has changed its form a dozen times, its soul has never been extinguished. It began in secrecy, was crowned in glory, and survived in humility. Its greatest strength has always been invisibility, the quiet, unheralded service of those who act not for reward or recognition,
but because they believe in something greater than themselves. And perhaps that is the true inheritance of the Order of Aviz. Not its medals, not its ceremonies, but its lesson, that the mightiest forces in history are often the gentlest, and that faith in any form endures best when it is humble. In the cool of evening, when the last light fades over the Alentejo hills, the stones of the old convent still seem to glow from within. The wind sighs through the arches, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and earth. Somewhere in that timeless stillness, the spirit of the green cross remains, no longer a call to arms, but a quiet invitation to remembrance. The guardians no one remembers have not vanished. They have simply changed their armor, from mail and steel to conscience and service. Their legacy lives not in the clamor of battle, but in the enduring peace of a nation that once through them found its voice. And so the story of the hidden knights ends where it began, in silence. Not the silence of loss, but of fulfillment, the silence of a vow kept across the ages. The green cross of Aviz still watches over Portugal, not as a relic of the past, but as a light for all who serve without being seen. The eternal flame of those who guard and are forgotten, and yet never truly gone.
Night settles over Portugal with the quiet weight of centuries. The air is soft and still, touched by the scent of the Atlantic. From the fortress at Aviz to the cloisters of Tomar, from the marble halls of Lisbon to the lonely watchtowers that once guarded the frontier, the land breathes in rhythm with its memory. Each stone, each cross, each faint inscription seems to whisper the same word: endure. The story of the Order of Aviz is not only the tale of a brotherhood of knights, nor even of the kingdom they helped to forge. It is the reflection of a nation's soul, the unbroken thread that winds from faith to discovery, from conquest to contemplation. To follow that thread is to trace the evolution of Portugal itself, from a frontier carved in battle to an empire stretched across oceans, and finally to a people who found greatness not in dominion, but in endurance. Under the calm glow of the moon, the old convent of Aviz seems almost alive again. The shadows gather in the cloistered corridors like silent monks returning for prayer. In the chapel, where the frescoes have faded to ghosts, a candle burns on the altar. Left by an unseen hand, perhaps, or lit by some traveler who felt the weight of history pressing gently upon the heart. Its flame flickers beneath the carved green cross, the same symbol that has guided centuries of Portuguese courage. Outside, the wind carries the murmur of the olive trees. If one listens closely, the rustle of their leaves resembles the distant sound of a procession, armored feet treading over gravel, voices chanting in ancient Latin, the clink of steel on stone. They are echoes not of ghosts, but of memory itself, of vows spoken, of missions undertaken, of horizons sought beyond sight. The Knights of Aviz no longer ride forth in defense of faith, yet their purpose endures in subtler forms. It endures in the quiet dignity of a soldier standing guard on a distant shore, in the patience of a sailor watching the dawn rise over the Atlantic, in the resolve of a people who, though small in number, have never ceased to look outward, to imagine, to believe.
That is the hidden fire that once drove caravels into the unknown, and still, in its quiet way, burns on. History often forgets its gentlest architects. The names that thundered through battle fade, while those who built in silence remain unseen. But the Order of Aviz belongs to both worlds, to the noise of crusade and to the hush of prayer, to the sword and to the star. Their work was never about conquest alone. It was about creation, about building something lasting from the fragile materials of faith and courage. As centuries purned, their meaning changed, as all things must. From monks to explorers, from kings to common soldiers, the brotherhood's essence flowed like a river, adapting to new courses. Each age redefined it, yet none could erase it. For at the heart of Aviz was a principle too simple and too profound to die, that service, freely given, is the truest form of strength. In modern Portugal, where the past lies gently folded into the present, the cross of Aviz still gleams on medals, on memorials, on the banners of regiments. But its truest place is not on stone or silk. It is within the quiet heart of the nation itself, the heart that remembers where it came from, even as it dreams of where it might go. And so the story drifts toward its end, not in triumph or tragedy, but in peace. The knights who once guarded the borders of a fragile kingdom have long since vanished into the flow of time, yet their watch continues, unseen, in the steadfastness of a people who learned from them that courage need not be loud, and devotion need not be visible. If you walk the old roads of Alentejo at dusk, the air still holds a hush that feels almost sacred. The sun lowers behind the hills, casting a glow that turns the fields to gold. Far away, the ruins of Aviz rest beneath a sky of deepening blue. For a moment, the world seems to pause, and in that pause, it is easy to imagine the green cross shining faintly, as though the centuries themselves were remembering. It is the same cross that fluttered on the sails of caravels bound for India, that glimmered on the shields of knights defending a newborn nation, that now rests quietly on the breast of a modern soldier, a symbol not merely of religion nor of empire, but of constancy, of service offered in faith, whatever faith may take. And when the candle in the chapel burns low, and its final flame flickers into darkness, the silence that follows is not empty. It is full, full of the weight of memory, of the echo of prayers, of the unending story of those who guarded what they loved without asking to be known. The Order of Aviz began in secrecy, and in secrecy it remains, not as a hidden sect, but as a presence woven into the soul of a nation. Theirs was a legacy not of noise, but of endurance, not of conquest, but of creation, a quiet glory, patient and undying. And as Portugal sleeps beneath the eternal stars, that green cross, ancient, steadfast, and serene, still watches. The guardians no one remembers are still here, and in their silence, the kingdom endures.